what the general pattern is, right? So one of the things I want to highlight, right? Most people have probably heard a talk on SAFe. You guys are probably implementing SAFe at this level of scale. I think of the difference between reference architecture and reference implementation. A reference architecture is like the basic patterns of Agile at scale. And so I think SAFe is dead on in terms of the basic patterns, right? There's different team-based structures at different levels of the organization. There's a governance model that wraps around team level, program, portfolio, and strategy. There's roles and responsibilities, right? All that kind of stuff. Underneath that, right, that pattern is really, really sound. The SAFe model itself is a reference implementation of a fundamentally sound reference architecture. And so what you're starting to see SAFe do is to emerge several different varieties of that reference implementation depending upon size and scale, okay? Just be really clear, those are not the only reference implementations out there. So I don't really care about methodology and what methodologies you guys choose, but I think we gotta get really, really clear on what the patterns, the underlying patterns of that at scale, so you can make good tailoring decisions as you're thinking about introducing these methodologies. And so there's 4 basic categories of teams that I tend to think about in terms of a structure. There's typically shared services teams, component teams. I know we'd like them not to exist, but they do and they will, okay? There's your typical prototypical Scrum feature teams, right? That's the next level up. And then what I call program teams, sometimes I call them product owner teams, sometimes I'll call them requirements clearinghouses. We use all kinds of different words. But there's usually something at scale in the presence of dependencies that is a coordinating entity that basically does look ahead, manages cross-cutting concerns, resolves dependencies before the teams get them. Right? So it's a pattern. And that pattern gets implemented all kinds of different ways. SAFe has a way of implementing it. I've done it 10 different ways over the last 8 years, probably more than that, okay? But there's a pattern of coordination that happens at the program level that is pretty much essential in the presence of dependencies. There's typically some sort of team that rides across the top that does prioritization decisions, makes the economic trade-offs, right, that kind of stuff. So at the different levels of the organization, what we're gonna have is we're gonna have different kinds of teams to do different functions within the system. I want teams everywhere. They're not all going to be Scrum teams, right? They're not all going to deliver a user story at the end of the sprint, right? But we want teamwork and collaboration at all levels, right? We want to reduce latency and reduce handoffs. And so what that tends to look like as you start to scale up are groups of teams down at the bottom that provide shared services, groups of feature teams. At the program level, you might be organizing around value streams or product lines, or there's all kinds of different things you can organize around at that level. There's some typical coordination body that lives at that level. That level is subordinate to the portfolio teams at the top, okay? So you start to take these base patterns and you start to think about how do I create collaboration at every level, and how do I start to think about, and I know hierarchy is kind of a bad word here, but like a hierarchical relationship, a flow between strategy and execution, and a feedback loop across that stack, okay? So that's the basic pattern that we're kind of looking at. And then governance within that begins to look a lot like Scrum down at the lower level, Kanban at the middle level, and Kanban at the portfolio level. Right? If we're doing a 4-tier governance model, we might put a Kanban up at the investment tier. So we'll probably have a combination of Scrum and Kanban teams operating at the lowest execution level. And then we'll have some sort of coordinating entity that's decomposing the work and making value trade-offs and dealing with cross-cutting concerns and dependencies that are operating in some kind of middle tier Kanban. And then some sort of top tier that's basically taking it from ideation all the way to market value. Okay? And so that's a basic pattern, and I know that's illegible from out there, but it's in the deck, it's in the paper, and I don't go super deep into it even in the paper, but you'll get the general idea if you're generally familiar with Scrum and Kanban and stuff like that, right? It's not rocket science, right? But it's a basic pattern that we believe works at scale. And then the last thing, and this is a super high level treatment, is the idea of different metrics, right? So at the execution level, backlog size, velocity, burn down, escape defects, commit percent, acceptance ratio, scope change. In the middle, we start thinking about things like cycle time, features blocked, rework, top layer, tack time, cycle time, ROI, capitalization, things like that. Okay? So that's the class of problems that we're solving at each level within this reference architecture. So the challenge, right, kind of getting back to where we are within the model, you understand your business case, you understand your approach, the levers that you're going to pull organizationally to start to introduce change, right? How you're going to start to think about change management. your theory and approach for what are the objects within the enterprise that you're going to form and develop, and then what is it that you're shooting towards over time, and then very systematically, how are you going to get there?